So we move on to the next part of our morning, and I have with me here three extraordinary experts and academics in the field of global health. First of all, Michael Merson, who's Professor of Global Health at Duke Global Health Institute. He also founded this institute, and it's become an extraordinary center of research and producing enormous amounts of young academics who then move on to go into global health. Adam Kamradt-Scott, who's Associate Professor at University of Sydney, who has become one of the leading voices in the area of health security, and Suerie, who's here with us at the Global Health Center as Director of Research, and also visiting lecturer at the Graduate Institute. I've asked them each to speak on a specific area of their expertise, but obviously we will also move into more general questions around global health governance and some of the issues that have been raised by David Held and by some of the questions. And for once, we have a reasonable time for such a panel, which also will allow us to open it up to you for commentary and questions. I'll start with a couple of questions to the people on the panel, and then we'll move over to you to try and take it even further. We have these three areas, as I said, in our research project: AIDS, health security, symbolized by Ebola, and one of the really, really wicked problems we face right now in global health and global health governance, antimicrobial resistance. I'd like to start with asking Mike Merson I nearly have to say, the usual question, because if we talk about gridlock in global health governance, and particularly then if we talk about ways out of gridlock and new ways of approaching problems, then AIDS is, of course, highly symbolic. And many of you will know this famous sentence in global health, or one should say in international health at the time: AIDS changed everything. And so my question is to Mike, to start off the discussions. What is this everything? What did AIDS change? And was it sustainable? Do you think, looking back, it changed the right things?
Thank you, Ilona, and hello to everyone. A nice, simple question to start with. David, let me say I really enjoyed your talk. Coming from this Trump land, it's always difficult to visit any other country right now. Almost embarrassing at times. But, sorry? Oh, join Britain, yes, okay. But I would say to you that, before I get to the question, that for me, the optimism is the path I hope we will talk about. And I think what we see in America, particularly in universities, is our young current generation. They are really the future. At least in my own country, I feel that is where we really need to invest. And the threats to our educational system is perhaps the greatest threats that worry me in terms of our future. And there is a real attack now, I'm sure you know, on the educational sector. But we really, as professors, need to fight that tooth and nail, whether we talk about state universities or private universities, because they are, I think, the path for the future. Now, to get to your question. So, of course, we have to go back, and I don't want to repeat what I will be talking about this afternoon when we talk about the book my colleague Stephen Inrig and I wrote about the global AIDS response, which we will talk about at 4 o'clock. But I think clearly we faced a crisis over AIDS that really became apparent in the early 90s, when many of the people that had been early infected 10 years later became sick. And this was frightening. This was a disease that was at that time, really was presumed fatal. And it was transmitted through sex and drugs and through blood. And mother-to-child transmission was as well. That was the innocent way of it being transmitted. So we were faced with a real global crisis, and that was a great threat to the World Health Organization. We can talk more about, as I say, we'll talk more about this later. But clearly there was the perception that the governance mechanism that existed for AIDS was insufficient. And we can talk later, as I say, about the reasons for that. So that started a cycle of change. First, we had something called, after WHO's program abruptly shuts down, we start something called UNAIDS, which is a joint and co-sponsored UN program. And that's soon followed by the Global Fund, but not just to fight AIDS, but to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And that's another story, which we can talk about later. And then we get the US government with PEPFAR, the largest bilateral program in the history of US foreign aid, tripling the aid to Africa. So you wind up in AIDS with a rapid change in governance, not in a systematically planned way. Each one of these came about, honestly, for different reasons. And it left us with a plethora of actors in the AIDS governance field. At the same time, you had a great amount of resources coming in to deal with the AIDS crisis. Part of this was due to enormous advocacy by civil society, by people infected with the disease. And we had a dramatic change in the late 90s in AIDS with the advent of a technology, namely treatment, which could keep you alive, as we now know, for many decades. So we went from a fatal disease, which caused great fear and alarm, to a disease that was completely treatable. Not cured, but treatable. And this gave a lot of hope and a lot more resources. Close to $125 billion have now been invested in the movement to get everyone treated with AIDS drugs. And if you get people who are completely on AIDS drugs and their viral load is suppressed, they will not transmit. They cannot transmit the virus if they are fully suppressed on AIDS treatment. So what happened in a nutshell with AIDS was a reaction to a global crisis. We didn't know in the beginning how much it would spread, how it wound up being 2/3 of infections in sub-Saharan Africa, for reasons we can go into, but not terribly relevant here. And then a great amount of resources that followed that. And so where are we today? We are left with numerous main actors. I could name 6 or 7 at least. And you have this concept of polycentricity, where you have multiple actors, a lot of resources, and now a treatable disease. So I would say we were highly adaptive as a world in responding to AIDS, not maybe in the most logical way, but we did get an enormous amount of energy, commitment, and resources to dealing with the pandemic. Now, where do we go from here? Can all of these organizations survive? Can all of them continue to raise the funding that they've been able to raise? Only half of the people that need to be on AIDS drugs today in the world are on AIDS drugs. And there are parts of the world, particularly in Southern Africa, where we are seeing an increase of prevalence of HIV back again to 25, 35, even 40% in young boys and girls because of the rapid growth in young people, particularly in Southern Africa. And how are we going to cope with that? So I think your question about sustainability, I don't know that we can maintain. My gut feeling is we will not be able to maintain the level of resources that these agencies will have less money. Certainly PEPFAR in the US is already facing dramatic cuts. Whether they will be implemented or not by the US Congress, I don't know. Some of you may know that the only issue that the Democratic and Republican Party have agreed on for the past 25 years has been legislation around PEPFAR, because it was started by the Bush administration, endorsed by the Obama administration, and Trump has been unable to kill it because of the strong sentiment within the Congress for both the Democrats and the Republicans. But PEPFAR is under attack. UNAIDS is under attack. The Global Fund is surviving, but having its own issues right now. And so I think I'm optimistic that because the donor community has invested so much, and we know how much can be achieved through treatment, that there will be, Ilona, sustainability. But I don't know that it will be at the level that it's been at. And I think there will be pressure for the AIDS community, I use the word community in the broadest sense, to collaborate more with TB, with malaria for sure, but also with other health issues, like NCDs, for example. The platforms that have been created around the world for AIDS treatment can certainly provide platforms for universal health care and for treatment of other modalities. So, hope I've begun to answer your question.
Thank you, Mike. Let's move to Adam. There's competition for AIDS funding, of course, for health security funding. I'd like you also to take a bit of a historical perspective and then looking back and forward. If one takes the Ebola crisis and says, you know, what was expressed there, after all, it was an area where we had a global treaty. After all, this is the oldest area of international and global health. As I mentioned, since the mid-1800s, one's been working on sanitary conventions, cooperation, etc., etc. But interesting also that one of the first, I'd say, knee-jerk reactions was WHO didn't do its job, let's build a new agency. But that didn't come about. So what's your assessment, both in terms of looking back what happened, why didn't people create a new agency? Had they learned actually from another area of global health? And where do you see the sustainability and the governance innovation that has happened around this whole health security thing? Just a little question.
Can I just make one other addition before you go? You may not know this, but Houghton Mahler seriously thought about creating, was under a lot of pressure because there was thought of creating an agency for AIDS. And he did not allow that to happen as Director General of WHO, promising that WHO could handle the pandemic, which of course it did not. But it's something to think about in your answer.
Okay, promises, promises. Adam.
Yeah, and I guess this is the thing. I really hate being pessimistic. I like the idea of optimism, but wow. Okay, so if we look historically, I think, and I'm going to fast forward to sort of present day and then sort of go backwards. So fast forward, I think it's important to appreciate, and I think this has kind of really gone almost unremarked in the health community, global health community. The World Health Organization has had its most fundamental change to its mandate in its 70-year history. And that change occurred in January of 2015 when a special session of the Executive Board authorised the WHO to establish what's called the Health Emergency Program. And this fundamentally seeks to change the nature of the organisation from it being a standard-setting, norm, agenda-setting organisation to an operational agency. And that occurred in a moment, I guess, with a recognition of Ebola, that the organisation needed to be not only do things differently, but to be seen to be doing things differently. I have some reservations about the health emergency program, primarily because I think it raises expectations for governments and people around the world that the WHO is going to be this new sort of first responder agency, and of course the organisation is not that, and member states have historically really resisted the idea that it would be interfering in their domestic affairs. And so I think there's a real challenge ahead for the WHO in making sure that that health emergency program works. And if we do take a historical perspective, I mean, the last time that WHO played a very operational role was actually with the malaria eradication program. So this was set up in the 1950s. It was WHO's very first operational global eradication program. And of course, malaria was eradicated, wasn't it? The organisation was very prescriptive, it was very operational, and its program didn't succeed. To the extent whereby when the proposal was launched to eradicate smallpox, the Secretariat here in Geneva actually said to member states, no, we're not interested, find someone else to do it. And it was only really politics of the Cold War which resulted in WHO effectively being forced into launching the smallpox eradication program. And of course now we hail it as WHO's biggest success, but the organisation itself, as a result of its experiences with malaria, didn't really want to get involved. And all of that's documented by Frank Fenner, who was the guy that ran it. So the organisation has got a lot of changes, a lot of challenges ahead, and I'd like to think that we as an international community, I mean, everyone was very dissatisfied with the WHO's response to Ebola. The question was, though, like, people were unhappy with previous outbreak responses and the organisation's management of it. I think probably the closest where there was international agreement that WHO did a really good job was with SARS. But then within a 2-year time frame, we saw member states move to constrict the organisation, to put new mechanisms of control on WHO so that it didn't have the same level of autonomy that it exhibited during SARS. And what we see now with the IHR and the emergency committee structure is basically a representation of that. It's an attempt by member states to make sure that there's a little bit more opportunity for them to intervene before WHO makes decisions that may adversely affect them. We saw with 2009 with H1N1 swine flu a series of commissions being held and recommendations being passed on what needed to change. And initially everyone was paying a lot of attention to that, and then time went on and the opportunity for change evaporated. Ebola happened and we saw this new health emergency program being launched. And again, there's an opportunity here for things to progress. But if and again, I hate being a pessimist, but if I look at the history of the WHO in particular, I'm genuinely concerned that we're not going to see the sort of change that conceivably we need. And that largely comes back down to governments.
An Australian pessimist. So we'll come back to these issues. I'm going to try and lay out some of the ground with a range of questions, and then we can pick them up. Suerie, moving on to antimicrobial resistance, one could ask, why was there not more foresight around this, maybe? Why did member states not respond when WHO tried to draw their attention to the importance of antimicrobial resistance, which I believe was quite early on? Why then did it make it to the top of the agenda? But where is it moving now? And what about the governance of AMR? There have been suggestions also here of a treaty, a convention, a framework, because it needs so many actors. Could you give us your view of why it didn't emerge sooner, why there was so little action, and how valid present governance proposals and solutions are?
Great. Good morning, everyone. First, let me congratulate my colleagues, Ilona, Dario, and Michaela, and others on the reaching the end of this really exciting project. I think it's great to be here with all of you, and a very apt moment to be looking back at some of the major events and changes that have happened in the field of global health for the past 2 decades or so. I think you raise a lot of very important questions around AMR, and I've been thinking about how do we compare what's happening now with AMR to the experience of HIV, the experience of outbreaks punctuated by the most recent Ebola outbreak. And I think partly one of the reasons why I think AMR did not emerge was because there are, I think this is true for scholars of public policy, there's of course a limited number of slots at the top of the global agenda, and in fact the world was quite occupied with HIV 15 years ago, when the last time WHO really made a big push on AMR back in 2001. The world became quite preoccupied with a number of other issues that did rise to the top. What I was quite struck by, though, in listening to David Held's lecture earlier this morning, is that a number of the elements that you were tracing out in terms of what are pathways to move beyond gridlock, I think we do see in the AMR case. And one of those pathways is leadership. I think we saw a few key leaders from a few member states and within the intergovernmental system and from the non-state sector saying now is the time for AMR to rise higher on the agenda, and they were quite successful in working together, certainly across standard silos, I would say, to do that. I think we also saw this coalition of non-state actors with like-minded states, and this, a very interesting group of people coming from the science world, from agriculture, from civil society, from the private sector, working together with a few governments who said, let's really put this on the agenda. I think the key question, though, is that we are still in early days for AMR, I would say. And we just had the high-level meeting, I think it was now about 2 years ago. And so what remains to be seen is will the key protagonists in the story seize the policy window that's opened to put in place durable mechanisms to actually have an effective response to AMR over the next decade, because we know that there are limited spots at the top of the agenda, and we also know from studies of policymaking that there are windows that open and then those windows close. And Adam was just mentioning that he believes the window, the post-Ebola window, has closed. It may have closed. I'm inclined to agree with you there. I think it's not all the way shut, but it's closing. Let's put it that way. And AMR, I think the window is still open. But what we learn from multiple studies is that if you don't put in place institutions, for example, such as the Global Fund or such as the international health regulations, then once that window closes, you won't have put in place the groundwork to sustain progress. And I think this is really the moment we're at in AMR. Do we have already those adequate institutions in place, or do we not? So let's remember, we don't have a global fund. And I'm not sure to what extent the existing major funding pots will shift or expand or reframe their activities to address AMR. I've seen a little bit of that, dancing around with language to say what we're already doing on malaria, what we're already doing on TB, what we're already doing on HIV is addressing AMR. I think that's not quite it's not quite enough. I think we don't have a treaty, right? We have a very solid treaty that's gone through multiple iterations for outbreaks, international health regulations. I don't think we're going to see a treaty anytime soon. Not because it's a bad idea, not because it's not needed, but because that does not seem to be the direction in which global governance activities have been moving. And I think the example of coming from climate change and a number of the examples that David was giving just a few minutes ago are very much echoed in global health. We see lots of activity. We see convergence around global action plans. We see convergence around a high-level declaration, around common goals, around certain agreements and norms regarding what should and shouldn't be done. But not a lot of appetite to put that into a legally binding, formal international treaty. And part of the reason for that, I think, comes from the uncertainty around the issue itself. And this is the last point I want to make. One of our colleagues here, Joost Pauwelen from the International Law Department, has done a lot of research and writing on this notion of informal lawmaking, or what I would call informal rulemaking. And he argues that when there's a lot of uncertainty around an issue, sometimes it doesn't even make sense to have something that really locks you down, something as difficult to change, shackles he calls them. It's difficult to change as international law. What makes sense is, in fact, lots of informal initiatives that might add up at the end of the day to an effective and functioning system. But right now we have, in fact, lots of gaps on the map. When you look at where do we know about resistance, the emergence of resistance, how fast is it spreading, what are the causes, what policies do we have in place that actually slow down antimicrobial resistance, mostly the global map is blank. We have little spots of data from different countries for a few pathogens, but mostly that global map is blank. And we know that when there are entrenched interests that don't want certain changes, they can also take advantage of the situation of uncertainty. So I don't think we're moving towards a treaty in the next 5 years, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 years. But I think the key questions to wrestle with now are, do we have the institutions in place in this window of opportunity that's opened, or are we not quite there yet? And are this sort of plethora of bottom-up initiatives that we're seeing emerging, when you add them all up together, is it enough to actually deal effectively with AMR or not? And do we have good ways of knowing that? And I throw that question out to you.
Thank you, Suerie. And of course, if we go back to 1851, it took until the 1890s until the sanitary convention, conferences led to a sanitary convention. So some of the international agreements we've had post-war actually were a bit faster. We can say, particularly if we look at the Framework Convention on tobacco control. But I'd like to go back to something that is similar in all three areas, and it actually happened the very first time with HIV/AIDS, one of those firsts again, and that is taking a health issue to the United Nations. Of course, with HIV/AIDS, it went to the Security Council, then also to the UN General Assembly. But there's another similarity here, that depending who you talk to, at certain points in time, the issue like AIDS, like AMR, and of course Ebola, have all been framed and defined as health security issues, and as that being moved into other spheres of action, indicating other types of partners are needed, and trying to move from, what some colleagues call low and high politics, saying if something's really important. Again, we just saw that with certain new trade rules that the American president wants to introduce or has introduced. He's done that by defining them as security issues, and that, of course, also gives him the direct power to act. So some thoughts from you on what does it mean taking health to the Security Council and to the UN General Assembly? What is won? What is lost? Again, just a historical vignette is that there was a reason that an independent World Health Organization was founded after the Second World War, because in the League of Nations, health was part of the League. It was an office in the League. And when all the crises happened around the Second World War, also the Health Office was incapable of functioning because it was totally subject to political fights. Whereas today, if you go to the Eastern Mediterranean region office of the WHO, countries that are fighting each other out there actually do sit around the table. And it's worth, keeping that in mind. So is that going to the UN, going to the Security Council, what's won, what's lost? And sometimes in WHO, one has the feeling that colleagues only feel their issue is really important if they manage to go to the UN General Assembly. And this year, we already have two issues. We have the TB and the NCDs. And now, actually, WHO has opened a window for member states to maneuver around those two issues, trying to make tuberculosis more important because NCDs is more controversial. And so, in a way, WHO has created its own pitfall by going there with two issues. And so, commentaries from your side. Let's start with Michael again, because AIDS was the first. What difference did it make?
Interesting question. Let me say first, but I'll get to it in a second. But I've just completed serving as a member of the National Academy of Medicine committee that has issued a report on, the title is the future role of the U.S. government in global health, and what should the priorities be for the U.S. government We started our work before the election and we finished our work after the election, which was quite a challenge in issuing the report. But let me say that the issue, Ilona, that stood out, we had 12 recommendations, but the one issue, the one recommendation that was universal and adapted by everyone and completely supported by the US Congress was on global health security. And historically, framing a global health issue as a security issue has certainly in the United States been a very positive force in generating concern and therefore resources for health. Whether that is completely justified, it sort of goes back in the US to 9/11 and to the belief that came out of 9/11 that to avoid another 9/11 attack on the US, countries needed to have more security. They needed to get more assistance from the US in various sectors, and that would make them more stable, and there'd be less radicalism, less potential for attacks on the United States, what is often termed soft power. So I will say that health security, the issue of health security, has more than any other issue obtained the support from the U.S. public for health, the importance of health, and in turn has generated enormous resources from the Congress to support the Global Fund and other health entities. So first point is global health security, and this has now been 2 decades, where global health security is the most optimistic way of raising funds. And people use that framing a lot as a way of getting resources for health, good or bad. It is the phrasing. Now, second point, the advantage of doing things within the United Nations versus in a specialized agency. Certainly, in the case of AIDS, when Vice President Gore chaired the Security Council, that is when AIDS was taken up as an issue, the 6-month term that he was chair of the Security Council. Kofi Annan, of course, then followed with the Special Assembly that Ilona mentioned a year later, 2000, I believe it was. And that then led to the creation of the Global Fund. So you would certainly, I don't think, have been able to generate the resources and the political commitment from many nations, and also the establishment of global targets that came out of the special session, and then following that, the Global Fund, if we had not done this in New York. I don't think this could have been achieved by the World Health Assembly. Now, the price, of course, of that was, if you like, taking away the authority, taking away the impact, the influence of WHO in the AIDS field. But in all honesty, that had already happened. As we'll talk about later, when the Global Program on AIDS was closed by the donor community in 1995, abruptly, which we'll talk about later, the die had been cast. So in a way, having that rebirth through the General Assembly and through the Secretary General and through the special session really did greatly increase the momentum and resources for AIDS. Maybe that's not what we would have wanted, but at the time, it really made a difference in changing the global commitment to the disease. Kofi Annan in particular, who I know quite well, did, for various reasons, want to take this issue up. One other point I would make, and that is that in the late 90s, as you know, Ilona, after the Cold War, New York wanted to have more influence through ECOSOC. There was a window there where New York in general, the New York part of the UN, was looking to have more influence. And frankly, AIDS was one issue. Ambassador Butler, you all know from Australia, chaired ECOSOC at the time that UNAIDS was created, and we talked a long time about this. This was genuinely a desire by New York in the late 90s to have more influence on global issues, not just political issues, but global issues in other sectors. That's maybe a sidebar, but it's something to remember historically about what happened after the Cold War.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and I'd like to come back to those contextual political issues in the next round. Suerie, if you look at various of these health security governance issues, I remember you were part of the Harvard panel that analyzed the situation post-Ebola, and if I remember correctly, one of your panel members, one of your commission members actually made a suggestion to have a subcommittee of the Security Council deal regularly with health security. I know that Germany, in its application to join the Security Council for one of the non-permanent seats, was and is also considering how, in what form should it make health part of that candidacy without facing problems with some member states who do not like the construction of health security. So there's a lot of politics in that, and there's a range of dangers around, the NGO community. Health security basically doesn't really have an NGO community out there. It has a community that keeps warning us of the securitization of health issues. And at the same time, I remember sitting in a meeting in this very building on antimicrobial resistance, and Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer of the United Kingdom and one of the key advocates for antimicrobial resistance, was part of our meeting, and suddenly it goes ping, and she looks at her iPhone and she says, "Did it?" And so, we were all sort of totally different in the discussion, and she said, "Did it? AMR is now part of the security strategy of the United Kingdom. I have convinced David Cameron." So we can see the interplay of these issues. Would you comment on that? How did you experience it, and where do you stand on this political minefield?
Oh, terrific question. So I agree with all of the potential benefits that Mike was just outlining in terms of framing a health issue as a security issue. I think those are very clear. But I also see many of the risks that Ilona was not so subtly referring to. And in the Harvard LSHTM Ebola panel, there was quite active debate actually regarding this recommendation that was eventually endorsed by the full panel. But there was a lot of debate on the wisdom of asking the Security Council to look at outbreaks regularly as a quote-unquote security issue. And one of the compelling arguments that really gave me pause was, do you think the Security Council is any more legitimate, any more functional, any better a forum for dealing with these issues than, let's say, the World Health Assembly or the General Assembly or the G20, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that was a very important point, which is to say that we're also in a moment, we were talking about power shifts earlier, we're very much in a moment where the Security Council, I think, is, again, under the spotlight for under the spotlight and being examined, is it in fact the effective body that we need it to be, with the permanent 5 and the veto, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think the jury is still out on that. I think it was a gamble for the panel. But I think more relevantly, when we're looking at the perspective of today and what are some of the downsides of the security framing, if one of the upsides is getting the US and UK governments to sit up and pay attention and put money and political capital behind it, that can also be seen as a downside. And what I'm referring to, of course, is sometimes East-West politics, North-South politics, a perception that security issues what that really means is the self-interest of a few countries in the north or in the west. Once they see that this hurts their self-interest, they will put money and political muscle behind it, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is good for the rest of the world. And I think that's not, I don't think that's always true. And I think on the issue of outbreaks, for example, I happen to personally believe that improving national and global capacity to deal with outbreaks should be considered a human rights issue and a social justice issue and a development issue. But I can tell you that is absolutely not the way it's perceived right now. And partly, that is reflected in the absence of a civil society mobilization behind it. There were efforts to try to build that up, but when I talk to colleagues from NGOs, they say, yeah, we're not feeling it. We're not convinced, we don't see it, it's not a priority. And because there isn't that strong movement, I do think there is a weakness that we don't see, for example, in HIV. I mean, one of the reasons why the commitment to HIV in Congress is so strong is yes, people really believe it, I think, on both sides of the aisle, but there is also a fear that, wow, if we don't pass this appropriation, we are going to get slammed really hard by our constituents across left and right, because it is a strongly held issue in American and certainly in global civil society. So the absence of civil society mobilization that might result from securitization does have these long-term weakening effects, I think, on how we deal with certain issues. I wanted to make one comment, though, about taking issues to the General Assembly. And I think there is a risk that if we do it too much, we, meaning the health community, if we do it too much, the value might go down if we just think about the laws of supply and demand and scarcity. But one of the interesting functions that we see in the AMR case is when an issue that clearly was needed to be dealt with beyond the traditional health sector, needed to be dealt with in the area of food and agriculture and animal husbandry, an issue like that is taken to the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly very clearly legitimates WHO as the leading organization on this issue. That could not have been done within the WHO, right? You had to go beyond the WHO to clearly designate a global leading agency on this. And I think that is an important function. Beyond political attention and money and getting heads of state involved, there is a organizational outcome, a way of coordinating a system that's very difficult to coordinate. And that's a benefit of taking it to New York versus remaining in Geneva.
Thank you, Adam. If I could take you from this point, working with others. And of course, there's this big thing with the SDGs of multiple stakeholders and partnerships, and everyone should work with everyone. There should be the intersectorality, the cooperation between the UN organizations, etc., etc. But in the Ebola outbreak, following it, there was a partner that came to the fore that, again, made a heck of a lot of people very nervous, and that is to what extent should health organizations, humanitarian organizations, cooperate with the military? And that means both, the military of a country, but it also means the military that's been called in to help, as was the case in some of the Ebola-stricken countries. You've spent a lot of time talking to the military and representatives from that in your research project. What's your view? What are these other types of very pragmatic, realistic cooperations one actually needs if one wants to take certain health issues forward, if one wants to move health security, not necessarily as a military complex, but in the sense as, we in Germany say social security, soziale Sicherheit, and you say health security, and you mean Gesundheitssicherheit, not with a military connotation, but actually just keeping us safe. And that's what the general program of work of WHO says, keep people safe. So how does that work? And what other partners might emerge in global health governance that we haven't thought of in the past?
Okay, alrighty. So I guess, at least on the security side, and this kind of relates then with the inclusion of the military, there's obviously a lot of concerns, and I would say very legitimate concerns about the securitization of health issues. I personally come down on the side of being a pragmatist, in the sense that I think the security label that we are seeing, which is enjoying a certain level of parlance at the moment, is just a tool that policymakers are using to help engage actors like the United States and the United Kingdom. I think we've seen this in the past. We've seen other terms being applied. I think HIV is a classic example in that, you know, in the 1990s it was an economic issue. We needed to deal with HIV/AIDS in low and middle income countries because otherwise they'll never economically develop. And I think the security label which is being used at the moment is basically just another word which is being used as an agenda to try and push forward progress. And I think everyone generally that are using the security language and concepts are still genuinely committed to health, improving health outcomes. Like, I'm a former registered nurse, so like when I'm talking about health security, I am genuinely, like, I want to see better public health programs. I want to see the resources being released for that. I apply the same perspective, I guess, when we start talking about other actors and if we are talking about the military. I went to West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, much to the concern of my employer, the University of Sydney. But I went into the affected countries to look at the civil-military response and talk with actors, both civil society as well as members of the local public, national militaries and the foreign militaries. And I think one of the things which really came out there, there's a lot of concerns obviously from the NGO community, and again, very legitimate concerns about the blurring of boundaries between humanitarian actors versus military, what that means and where that conceivably can lead to. Humanitarians have also quite rightly criticised that the military is very expensive, and really at the end of the day what we should be doing, that they should just give us those resources and we'll do the job, and we'll do it much better. Well, okay, fair call, but let's be realistic. Governments aren't going to give those sorts of military grade assets to civil society actors. They've already paid for it in the form of the military, and if the military aren't doing anything, then conceivably it can be a resource which governments are choosing to use. Now, we can argue the whys and wherefores as to whether or not that's a positive development, but at the end of the day, governments will do what they're going to do anyway. And I think this is one of the big aspects that I'm working on at the moment, is what is the role of militaries in health emergencies, and what can they do from a public health perspective which we are comfortable with, and where are the red lines? And I think up until now, we haven't really had that sort of conversation. We've just simply gone, no, military is a bad thing, and let's keep them away. So I think there's a lot more work that we still need to do to try and work out exactly where those limits are. But at the end of the day, if your objective is about saving lives, again, former nurse, I'm of the view that I used to work in emergency departments. I will use whatever I need to save someone's life. And the other thing that I'll probably close with, we have these things like the Oslo guidelines, great principles, military should be used as a last resort. Guess who was in the room when the Oslo guidelines were drawn up? Pretty much about 30 European countries. One low or middle income country that wasn't European, Indonesia. And the Europeans come up with this idea that military should be used as a last resort. That's great. But as I was talking to someone in West Africa about it, they were like, yeah, but European countries, you've got your fire services, you've got your ambulance, you've got, you know, all these sort of emergency services. Here in Africa, we've got the military. That's it. And an example was used of a Liberian film star who went swimming off the coast of Monrovia and apparently got swept out to sea. They had to call on the military to do the search and rescue because the military was the only one that had petrol for their boat. You know, so when we talk about the practical realities of trying to deal with these types of events like health crises, you know, sometimes the militaries are the only ones with an operating health system in those countries. They're the best system, they're the only ones with resources. And the one thing that I would say positively about the military, there's many things that you could say negatively, but one thing is they follow orders. Try and get that from the NGO community.
Thank you, Adam. Suerie, I'd like to pick up that. You already alluded to it, and Adam also did, in terms of there is this power shift. Many of the rules have been made by the Western countries. The rules they make are related to their own realities, not the realities of others. And one of the ways global governance is dealing with this in the sphere of health is that they take the health issues to other political bodies that, of course, reflect this larger community. We've discussed one of them, the General Assembly, but of course there's been this increase of discussing health issues in the G20. It's gone to the regional organizations, etc., etc. Again, my question to you, what's won and what's lost, and what new conflict lines maybe emerge? I mean, in the negotiation for the G20 agreement, it wasn't, that unconflictuous between the Western and some of the other countries around AMR, for example. So, what are your views on this? How does one deal with this changed political context, and how could one make global health governance more equitable? But if it becomes more equitable, it'll also become much more conflictuous than it perhaps was in the last 10 years.
More equitable. Let me chew on that for a minute and come back to it. But I do think having more than one possible arena for making rules, coming to agreements, developing plans is both inevitable and can have benefits. It creates, pressure release valves. When you can't get agreement here, maybe you can get it there among a smaller number of players. And we see this in lots of other fields of global governance, not just in health. In trade, we've seen a shift outside the WTO now for almost 2 decades. And so one of the risks, of course, is that one of the benefits, I think, of having a more pluralistic system for rulemaking is not only the pressure valve, but also the ability to make progress faster. Another benefit is the ability to respond to specific needs in regions or by groups of countries, to make rules that are more reflective of your national priorities, to be more inclusive, etc. The risks are, of course, that you might have rules that overlap, that conflict directly with each other. That you have people working at cross purposes. And I think this is the big debate when it comes to, do we need more coordination or do we need more pluralism? Is fragmentation good or bad? And of course it's both, right? You see both. And the question of, for me, when is it counterproductive is when exactly you have these sub-global clubs, let's say, acting at cross purposes with each other. Now, the question of, is this a path for a more equitable global governance, or how do we make global governance more equitable? I do think there are interesting meta-governance norms, and you guys talk about this in your research project, that are emerging that are quite interesting around transparency, around participation, around evidence. So the idea that if we are going to make global rules that apply to everybody, there have to be certain standards of process that are met. There have to be, a much broader group of stakeholders who are consulted. There has to be, again, referring to Jost's work, this notion of thick consensus, and that as a product of that thick consensus, you're going to have a more effective set of rules and agreements at the end of the day anyways. So that it's in your interest to take the time to develop thick consensus. Now, what I'm concerned about is that I'm not sure how much these meta-governance norms have really sunk in. I think we see a few interesting shifts in that direction. For example, the election of the WHO DG last year, very, very much a more open process than we've ever seen before, much more participatory, much more transparent. A colleague who works with the Food and Agriculture Organization said, we are looking very closely at what happened at WHO because we want to emulate that for FAO when the election comes up in about 1 year's time. And so this idea that you can also transfer these meta-governance norms from one place to another, that's a reason for optimism, coming back to this notion of optimism. But we also see, of course, plenty of reasons why transparency, good governance, more democratic governance, rule of law, that is being challenged left, right, and center today. So I don't know if these meta-governance norms are going to hold. And I don't know if they're really going to deliver more equity in global governance.
Thank you, Mike. When you were working in HIV/AIDS and then all these organizations were created, etc., would you ever have thought that a new director of the Global Fund running, the big AIDS institution would stumble over Heineken?
Wow, that's a jump.
No, it's about norms.
Yeah,
it's about
no, I'm
cooperation.
thinking
okay.
about the challenge that people running these organizations have in keeping them thriving and building constituencies is enormous. And David, you talked a lot about leadership and how important leadership is. I think we don't think enough about leadership when we think about the success or failures of different organizations and the fragility of people and our weaknesses and our strengths, and how leaders themselves are not necessarily prepared to be leaders of such large organizations that they're often thrust in front of for different reasons. I think here, to the extent I understand the issue, we have someone coming out of the finance sector who is, as I understand it, I will tell you that Muhammad Pat, who was the previous candidate, was on my faculty. And so I spoke to him multiple times about what had happened to him in the recruitment process and how he felt he had been treated. And so the Global Fund goes from a ex-Nigerian health minister and a man of great sensitivity to the issues, particularly for Africa, a real giant as a figure, who suddenly is unacceptable and goes through another process that winds up with a very successful leader in the finance industry. And so he is placed in an organization that has been so critical, $3 to $4 billion a year for AIDS, TB, and malaria, that was worried about being able to continue to raise funds, came close, I guess, to making its replenishment in the last round. But still, he's probably thinking, don't I need support of a wide range of donors? And we all want to see the private sector play a role in health and be a partner in health. But of course, it gets to the very interesting ethical question of what aspect of the private sector is acceptable as a participant in a multilateral organization. Where is one's moral compass? Where is one draw the line where taking resources from a private company in a way is unethical and maybe even sends the wrong signal as to what my organization is about? I come from a university now that has its tradition in tobacco. And so we have had to live with that for generations. Universities in North Carolina. Right now, North Carolina economy is not tobacco dependent, but nevertheless, you cannot erase the history of our university being very much built on the back of tobacco. So I personally think the alcohol question is a tough one. And the fact that there are some benefits, if you like, from a health standpoint to very moderate amounts of alcohol. But that alcohol has also, though, contributed greatly to the kind of unfortunate behaviors that are quite negative in terms of our health. And certainly we've seen that in HIV. So I am probably less adamant than others might be about this. I think that if I were him, I would have taken a broad counsel. I would have gone to a much wider constituency, and I would not have gone that route unless I had had a consensus of sorts from people that knew my agency, knew AIDS, knew malaria, knew TB, and could understand the implications of taking the money from Heineken. I have a sense that this decision was too quick. I guess it was made by his predecessor, but still he is responsible for it. So it sounds like I'm a little wishy-washy on this, but I'm not as adamant that it's necessarily a bad thing, but I would have done it probably more carefully. And if I had taken the funds, I probably would have done it under certain conditions and that where it might have been acceptable to a much larger constituency. I think it's very bad I come back to the leadership issue. When you first take over as a leader of an organization, people look at what you do very often initially. What are some of your first steps? We've seen this with the Director General of WHO. What are your priorities? Where are you going to take us? That initial period is so important, I have found, in leadership. And this is not the way I would have started in one of my first decisions if I had ever, God forbid, been asked to run the Global Fund. So I think, Ilona, though, it does raise some very important questions about what is ethically and morally acceptable in terms of resources, and how do we work with the private sector. If we are going to work with them, what are the ground rules that we need to apply and need to be in place when we take resources from the public sector, from the private sector? Now, I suspect if we took a survey of people in this room, most would be appalled at the decision. I don't know. But I would still feel we should, it could maybe have been done in a more, rather than saying it's just a bad idea, maybe it could have been done in a way that more people would have accepted it. That's really where I stand on this. I don't know if you have, there was an ulterior motive to your question, but I think the leadership question is what I jumped to my mind immediately, that why to put yourself in this position so quickly when you take over such an important organization. Why do you start and put yourself in this position? That would have been my first reaction.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for being so open. I mean, my issue was really about the ground rules. And the ground rules that you mentioned, but to actually highlight that in terms of the governance of global health, what we see, and what for me this is an example, is that no health issue and no health organization is an island anymore. And that it's not possible, be it partly due to the SDGs, be it partly due to the pressure of the issues, to say, I'm about health, I'm about AIDS, you over in WHO might be doing alcohol, doesn't concern me, I do AIDS. I'm exaggerating this now, but to some extent, that's the issue. So first of all, where are the ground rules that actually bind the global organizations, and what are they in terms also of partnerships, etc.? I think we're in a new phase here, that this for me is sort of exemplary. And it's also that things have changed. I mean, I've been around in global health for quite some time. I mean, there was a time when all vaccination programs said, you know, we work with Coca-Cola to go the last mile. And at that point, it wasn't an ethical issue. The fact is, today it is, in the face of an NCD epidemic, pandemic, we must actually say, and marketing to children and all kinds of things. So I think I was alluding to two things. You can't be an island anymore, point one. And point two, who you work with actually changes over time because of new health issues, because of political changes, for a whole number of reasons, I think. And that was also a little bit part of my question around the military, 20 years ago, if we just asked in public health, should we work with the military? Everyone said, woo, work with the military. And now, it's an issue that we really, really have to grapple with. Suerie, coming to you, your focus very much in your research and work is access to medicines. And of course, and in AMR also, a key issue is the role of the pharmaceutical sector. And to what extent in AMR governance are there discussions with the industry? What role does the industry play? Can one do it without the industry? What's the situation there?
Well, I'm glad we get to talk about access to medicine, my favorite topic, but one which always raises a number of very interesting governance issues, certainly beyond pharmaceuticals. And I think it's quite interesting to observe in the debates on AMR, both how they build on previous debates that we've seen, for example, in the field of HIV, and 20 years of debates on intellectual property and access and flexibilities and R&D that better meets needs of people all around the world. And I very much see that reflected in current both debates on AMR, but also activities, funding streams, policies. It's very concrete what I think the outcomes are, and I'll be a little bit more specific about that in a minute. What we also see in AMR is innovation, I think, is the ability to do things differently thanks to what has happened for the last 20 years in global health. So to be, again, more concrete, we have, for example, today, a public-private product development partnership that was launched called GARD-P, jointly between WHO and the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, that is working together with the pharmaceutical industry to develop new antibiotics. You also have a broader ecosystem of pharmaceutical companies, both very large firms, the traditional big pharma, whose names you've heard of, and hundreds of small and medium enterprises, oftentimes being spun out of academia, startup firms with no money or very, very little money to keep them going, who are also quite active in looking at potential new products, new antibiotics and other products for AMR. And what is interesting to see is what kinds of different ways of working are possible and are being tested out. And I think one piece of concrete evidence is one of the first agreements that GARD-P has come to is with a small firm based in Boston that has an interesting drug candidate for gonorrhea. An issue that's very high on the agenda for AMR. That firm, because they didn't have a huge war chest of money from previous R&D, they're not a big firm. That firm was more willing, in my view, to come to the table and say, we're going to cut an interesting deal with you, and it's not going to take that much money because we need the money that you can put on the table and the credibility and your networks to run clinical trials in a number of countries. And we have the technology, we have the IP, we have the know-how on this specific product. And this opens up new avenues for collaboration that are not so easy to strike when the negotiating power between the two parties is different, which it is. Now, I think this is a great example of innovation. One of the features of this deal is not just the agreement to partner. We have lots of agreements like that. But the fact that in some of the upper middle income countries that are usually excluded from benefiting from these arrangements because they're considered too financially attractive, Mexico, Brazil are good examples. This deal allows for special access provisions in even some of these big markets. And again, part of that is because a small company doesn't have the networks, the distribution networks, for example, to make money in Mexico or Brazil. But as a quid pro quo, they said, if you want to have low-cost access to this new drug for Mexico, for example, then Mexico needs to contribute in some way to the R&D. And this is a new ask. A relatively new ask, I would say, because it used to be we're in the world of donors and recipients. We're in a world of North and South. We want money from the US and the UK to fund AMR antibiotics research. And it still is, in fact, primarily coming from the US and the UK. But the idea is, can we get other countries to actually put money on the table too? And South Africa has said, we will support GARD-P. Mexico and Brazil may, for example, host clinical trials or offer in-kind facilities or offer financial contributions to this R&D project because they say we will get something in exchange. And And this is a very different world from the world we were in 15 years ago in HIV, where you didn't have significant financial contributions coming from middle-income countries. And I think this is a quite different, much more polyarchic, in the sense that lots of players who are more similar to each other in their level of negotiating leverage, rather than a lot of power concentrated in the hands of just a few actors. And I think that does allow for certain kinds of innovation that you wouldn't see otherwise. Now, this doesn't mean that we've completely left behind the very difficult debates on intellectual property and who profits and who should put money on the table, and if the public invests and the private sector invests, who benefits and how much. All of that very much still core to the debates on AMR, innovation and access. So it's not that we've left that behind, but I do see these glimmers of new possibilities to innovate in terms of how do we solve very concrete problems because of polyarchy, because of fragmentation, because of building also on 20 years of what's been done before.
Thank you, Suerie. Adam, who pays for health security?
Maybe Mike wants to comment on this as to in terms of where Trump's going. So at the moment, I mean, health security as an agenda obviously has gone through a bit of a up and down phase. And so, you know, we saw the emergence of the term in the mid-1990s. It's 2000 before WHO adopts it. But by 2010, member states, and in particular a number of countries, Brazil, Thailand, Indonesia, they have raised objection with the World Health Organization about its utilisation of health security. And it gets to the point by 2011, WHO drops all reference to health security. The one document which the WHO produces, which I think was in around 2012, was on AMR, which talked about AMR being a global health security threat. But otherwise it was removed from its lexicon. Post-Ebola, everyone's talking about global health security again. And I hope you won't mind me putting in the plug. But this is one of the reasons why we're holding a conference in Sydney in 2019 on global health security. Because one of the big questions is, like, is this a good thing for us to be pursuing? What are the concerns about the utilisation of security language and concepts? You mentioned the lack of an NGO community around it. Like, let's engage those voices and let's try and move this debate forward. If the end of this conference we decide collectively there's 1,000 people hopefully going to come to Sydney. Everyone wants to come to Sydney, right? Then, you know, if the decision at the end of this is that actually, you know what, global health security, we don't want another thing to do with it, then that's fine. But I mean, at the moment, the US government has been one of the, obviously, the big funders behind it, putting in money and resources, not only via the Global Health Security Agenda, but also the Joint External Evaluation Alliance. We've seen pushback on that, and, you know, this is another example of where politics comes into play. So Russia is not so keen on the JEE process. The Australian government recently, I'm proud to say, has finally put in some money to health security. And for us as a country, which is admittedly we're one of the G20, but we've not usually sort of put this sort of amount of resources into a particular issue like this. But the Australian government is putting in $300 million. So basically half of what the US government has put in to focus on health security in the Asia-Pacific, or Indo-Pacific region, I should say. So, you know, we've got high-income countries, and it's this, in some respects, it's this enlightened self-interest that, you know, we're seeing governments sort of commit to this and putting in resources. And for me, again, I guess as a pragmatist, coming at it from it, is if we can utilise that language, these concepts, to try and get resources, so at the end of the day, public health is improved, I think that's a great thing. We need to be cautious. We don't rush into it blindly. I think the caution around things like the involvement of the military, the involvement of private sector actors like Heineken, all of those questions need to be really interrogated. And sometimes you'll make a bad call. I think this is the other thing, which perhaps going back to leadership, we also need to give people the ability to make a bad call and then try and fix it. And I think probably one of the clearest examples of that really was Tedros and appointing Mugabe as an ambassador. You know, he heard very quickly the response from the Twitter community, very loudly saying, what are you doing? And he reversed the decision. So I think in leadership, we also need to give people that space to be able to make the wrong call and then fix it as well. But all of these actors, I think some of the principles that we've abided by and that we've been holding on to, that have been guiding us conceivably for the majority of the 20th century, they're good principles, don't get me wrong. But our world has changed a fair bit, and I think some of those principles we at least need to question, and at least be able to willing to engage with other actors. The role of the private sector, you asked, I mean, earlier, like, you know, other actors that may come in. Well, unless we're talking about robots or aliens, I think we're probably we've got the plethora of all possibilities at the moment, but we've still got big questions to answer about the role of the private sector and the role of the private sector in health security. Is it acceptable? During Ebola, we saw a private sector actor going in, a for-profit organisation going in and providing Ebola treatment, providing care in Ebola treatment units. Everyone was kind of like, ooh, that's a little bit dodgy, isn't it? Because they've got a profit margin. Well, as one of the people who I interviewed from that company said, and you're trying to tell me that NGOs, when they get given like $20 million from a government, that they don't pocket any change that's left? Like, you know, they're always thinking about the next mission or whatever, but we accept the fact that it's an NGO because, well, it's, you know, the Red Cross or it's MSF, and we all think, oh, well, they're good. But who are they answerable to? Who's the, you know, at least with a private sector corporation, I'm being explicitly controversial here, but with a private sector actor, they've got a board of directors and they've got shareholders that they're accountable to. Some of the NGOs don't. So some of these ideas that we conceivably have been using to guide us, they're great. I'm not saying that we dispense with them, but I think we also need to question them and whether or not they're still appropriate for today.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Make one comment. I think one other thing I would add on that from the U.S. standpoint, we in the United States, when Ebola occurred in the United States, when those cases occurred, first in the Nigerian who was misdiagnosed in the emergency room in Texas, and then the nurses who were following inadequate precautions put out by the Center for Disease Control. They were following inadequate precautions, which was quite clear. You had a great interest there, and the big debate was whether the funding on global health security should be directed more to protect the United States in the United States, and how much of the money should be used abroad, because if you could protect the U.S. by bringing cases into the U.S. That debate continues, and I think that's where I think more thought could be given. The U.S., I don't think the U.S. politicians, and this was under Obama, really convinced the American public to invest heavily abroad as a way of protecting the United States. I think there was much more attention given to how could we have let such things happen in our own healthcare system. I just think thinking about those two separately helps. Now, the global health security agenda, which you didn't mention, but of course you know about, is a wonderful entity in principle. But it has been quite controversial in the U.S. in terms of how much the U.S. government should support it. Recently, the funds to CDC have been greatly cut back because there is not a strong political commitment to something like that being beneficial to the United States. I'm just phrasing that as an interesting point in terms of global health security. If you want to raise the funding, what is the best way to do it with politicians? And how should that funding be directed, to me is an interesting question. I don't know in Europe whether you've had these debates, but certainly we've had these debates in the United States. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Mike. And in a way, you've pre-discussed what I was going to ask as the last. No, this is very good. As a sort of quasi-last question from my side to the panel, and then to allow you to ask some questions. So please start thinking about them. It actually partly refers to what David has outlined to us. If the global system, in terms of its politics, in terms of its geopolitics, in terms of its economics, etc., is changing as much as I guess it is, what do you think is going to be the biggest impact on global health governance? Suerie.
It's a good question.
The biggest impact. From global health as we know it today, I think the biggest impact will be what I predict to be a decline in US financial contributions and political leadership in major global initiatives. I think it's not a foregone conclusion, but based on what we've seen from the White House over the last year, the risk is pretty high of that happening. And there will be all sorts of consequences to that, some of them terrible, and some of them may be interesting opportunities for those who have been less central players to take leadership roles. And I think the key question is, will other actors, whether governments or non-state actors, step up to fill what I think will be a vacuum? Because the US government did absolutely play a very strong leadership role over the last 2 decades in the creation of global health as we know it today through HIV and a number of other issue areas, including outbreak response. And perhaps I'm a bit too US biased, being an American myself, but I do think the withdrawal will have major impacts on the system.
I think that's going to happen, but I'm going to put one thing higher, and that's China. So my university has recently opened a campus in China, so it's given me a lot of opportunity to visit there in the past 5 years. We've also had a grant from DFID to work with the Chinese government in their global health policy. So I've spent a lot of time in China. And you all know the One Belt, One Road initiative. I don't know what the latest term is, but and the $1 trillion, whatever that's going to be. And it's not just in health, it's obviously in a number of areas. But in talking to the Chinese in the ministries and hearing their thinking, there's now almost something close to a USAID kind of entity being formed within China. I think it's part of your answer, which is that gap, quite coincidentally in a way, because I don't think the Chinese decided to make health such a priority in their development program, in their aid program. It just, I think, happened at a time when this withdrawal that you described so well is happening around the world. And I think what I've been thinking a lot about is, and talking with the Chinese about, is if they're going to be such a large, quote, donor, what does that mean to them, and how will they see that role? After all, if you think historically, China is the only, I think, example of a country that, 2 generations ago, even a generation ago to some extent, was a recipient. And they thought, and in some areas is still a recipient. And suddenly they're being thrust into being a major donor. And they're coming at it with a different perspective, history, and mind frame of what it means to be a donor. And if you go out to many African countries, they love working with China. They don't have to worry about human rights, and they don't have to worry about the kind of constraints that the US and Europe put on them as recipients. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying they like very often working with China. But I think one of the interesting questions for the global governance community is, how do we bring China and work with China? They don't really necessarily see the need for collaboration. They've been having these medical teams for years going around Africa. They've been having malaria programs and maternal and child health programs. So for me, the biggest question, Ilona, is how are we going to work with China? And how is China going to work with us as a major donor in the field of global health? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's important to set up, to accept that, and to set up opportunities for those kind of discussions and working together so that they can see themselves as a partner. Partnership is not right now their priority that I've seen. It's more what they can do for China at the same time they're giving foreign assistance. So I think that, to me, perhaps is going to be the most interesting and important question for the next decade.
Thank you. I would tend to agree, and those of you that regularly follow China will know that I think on Friday, the what's it called? The Central Committee will take the decision on the new development agency. Interestingly, though, it has decided it will be more like DFID than USAID, so it will not be within the Foreign Office. And that is already a very, very interesting decision. And of course, if one talks about China, it's in some cases, one needs to talk much more about those other initiatives like Belt and Road or like the enormous foreign investment strategy, plus the new development banks that sort of also lead to a new financing system, so that even in our thinking, we don't just focus on, in quotes, the donor role of China. For me, it was interesting as a conference about this very subject in Beijing in November, and actually they said something very interesting, because the Chinese medical teams had been in the Ebola-affected countries, and they said we need to learn. We found out we do not know how to work with communities. We do not know how to work with NGOs. Now, both things, if you've sort of analyzed some of China's role over the last years, is reasonably obvious to an outsider. But for me, I found it very intriguing that they very openly said, we did not know how to do this. We saw a gap. We're going to learn. We want trilateral cooperation. And so it will be interesting. So if you're in global health, watch China, watch the United States. Adam, who else do we need to watch?
I'd say very quickly, I guess my main concern, aside from all of the above, but I would actually add to that nationalism writ large and the move towards this populist ideology. I know we're talking a lot about that in international relations and politics more generally, but when I reflect on some of the driving forces which are driving the withdrawal of the United States and conceivably the increased role that China is playing in the world, nationalism is very much as a underwriting philosophy or issue there. And that causes me great concern, because when we're talking about progress or impacts on global health, all we need is really, we don't even need another a hot war. We just need to return to something like a Cold War, and we'll see again sort of our existing institutions start to fail in progressing matters. So that's my concern. And I think that's, if I was to add a voice of an optimistic note to this, I think that's where we, as, dare I say, citizens of our respective countries have a role to play, that we can try and use our internal structures to really push back on this. And if we can do that, then hopefully we won't go down of what I think would otherwise be quite a dark road in terms of health.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up now for comments or questions. Who would like to start? Dario, yes. You have a mic.
I have the microphone here, yeah, if it works. No, just wanted to build on a couple of points very quickly that were raised, and maybe you can respond to that. The first one was on innovation. It was made by Suerie when she was talking about AMR and the role of the private sector. I think that part of what makes global health governance exciting is this innovation, is this sort of polycentric galaxy of actors, which is what we focused on in the project. What is interesting, though, and it's a point that you touched upon, but I think I just wanted to emphasize a bit more, is the fact that precisely this increasing engagement and the fact that the contribution of the private sector will be necessary for the R&D pipeline in AMR is that there needs to be a very high expectation on the WHO or anyone else to exercise its convening, its coordinating, its leadership role. So when we talk about leadership, it's not just political leaders and states, but it's also how we can have a direction towards this innovation that we have in global health governance. And we see that there are increased expectations now in the WHO in retaining and re-exercising this leadership. And it would be pretty much relevant. I started thinking about it when you said that on AMR, because it refers, for example, to the fact that we have a lot of partnerships now and the role of the private sector focusing a lot on late market entry stage, for example, in the R&D pipeline, but not in where the real bottleneck is, which is the drug discovery phase. The other point was more on multipolarity.
Short.
Yeah, very, very short. The other one was on multipolarity. I think one thing we discount a little bit when we talk about China and India is the fact that, and it was emphasized in the wonderful book that you recommended, Post-Western World, is the fact that we had seen already forms of engagement and influence by other countries that we don't traditionally associate with health. And this happened, for example, with HIV/AIDS, the role of developing countries and groups in developing countries raising the profile of certain aspects of the issue, and we neglect that. These inclusive forms of discussions will probably play a big role and need to play a big role in the future of global health governance.
Thank you, Dario. There was a hand over there. Can you just? I'll collect a couple and then I'll ask you to come back with the issues you'd like to take up.
Thank you very much. I was
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Valerie Nodra. I'm from the Ministry of Health in Bern. So thank you very much for this discussion. I was actually wondering, you were quite critical about WHO's health emergency program and in fact about this shift from its normative role towards operational action. Now there is again this ambition to become more operational. So I was just wondering if you could comment about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Back there, please, Steve.
I had a question for Suerie, but I guess also for Mike. For Suerie, one of the challenges, obviously, with these public-partner-private innovations you talked about is we don't always know where diseases are going. And so for a country like Mexico to think preemptively, I want to invest in a company to help reduce the financial burden, since we don't know where science is going, how do we create a way for countries to collect money on science that hasn't been discovered yet, right? So if I have a promising drug and so Mexico is going to put in some money and they'll get a guaranteed lower cost on the drug once it comes to market, that's really good for a known drug with a known, but with HIV, we obviously started with reverse transcriptase inhibitors and then protease inhibitors, and when should Uganda have invested to get access to these low, and some of them of course work in combination, so it makes it really tricky. And can you talk a little bit about strategies to overcome some of the frontiers of science as they move and how nations can tap into some of that?
Thank you. Anyone on this side? Yes, please. Dario, go back there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hendrik Schmitzke-Nott. I'm from the German mission here in Geneva. And I would have a question to the panel, you being all academics and being allowed to think and speak freely. How would...
Compared to who?
How would the ideal global health architecture look for you to help achieve the sustainable development goals and tackle today's challenges?
Now there's an easy question from a member state. Anyone else here on this side, up there? Okay, then let's let's allow David to ask a question. David, it's coming from this side. Dario is doing his daily exercises.
It's about your very interesting reflections on China. It's quite hard to read. China's foreign policy in many respects. But there is a clue for health I think, in the area of climate change. Over the last 25 years, the Chinese ministry responsible for climate has gone from being an outlier on the organizational hierarchy to directly underneath the Communist Party leadership. That reflects its changing priority for China. During this time, the Chinese have come to see climate change as a clear threat to their three core organizational principles: sovereignty, stability, and economic growth, essentially. And therefore, China has mobilized its huge resources with that perceived threat to make China, to put China in a leadership role, not just internally, but globally, and not just as an advocate, but now as a huge investor in alternative technologies. Huge. So that story gives us kind of fundamental hope, I think, about China and health. China's instinct is bilateralism, by and large. But to the extent that global health challenges are threats to China's core organizational principles, then I think you will see China act much more decisively as a collaborative player on the global stage, based on the climate case. That's a hypothesis, and we will see. Thank you.
Well, actually, we already see some of that happening. What you say, if you look at health, is it Health 2030? Yeah, you see clearly both a commitment to the national health, but very clear reference to global health responsibilities, great interest in health security. And beyond the bilateralism, which is now expressed in the new agency, the interesting thing is really the notion of interconnectivity. And that means, transnational action. And China, of course, was one of the founders of WHO and has been, if not a leading actor in WHO, but a very reliable actor in its governance. So, but the question is, to what extent will countries like China, India, etc., we will ask the Indian ambassador this afternoon, continue to invest in the old multilateralism, or where are they more interested in new organizations that they themselves build, or will they continue with what they are presently doing, which is a sort of parallel multilateralism? We still work in the old organizations, but we're also building our own reference group and alliances, and Shanghai Cooperation being one very interesting example. And some of those organizations we don't even look at. I mean, Heike Nikogosian, who is here, wrote a chapter for us on those kind of organizations in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. That also then, span into the Arab world, etc. That's, if you ask me, one of the challenges really in global health, to actually look in a much more open way and how the non-Western world is organizing itself, what it is doing, and also what it is already contributing to global health. This is an important point that Dario made, that despite very high contributions, some of the first very successful public-private partnerships were done in India when eradicating polio. But hardly anyone talks about them as a model, because nobody from the West was involved, but it was the Tata Corporation in India. So I think, here is also one of our intellectual challenges as academics, to actually start researching that, being much more open, and working, of course, with academic colleagues in those countries that have already done this, and there, of course, language and issue starts to play an important role. Over to you to answer whatever questions you feel.
So I want to just follow up on Ilona's point and your point. With regard to China, I can't tell you how many seminars and meetings I've been in where the Chinese will invite many international figures and want to talk about what China has done, let's say in climate change, as the example for the world. They would like to think that what they have done will work for others. There's a real pride almost. It's a political, obviously, there's a political angle to this. But I will say that part of their international being more collaborative and is still, though, with a lens of showing we have done it well, and what we have done well, maybe you can do well. As also, we were a developing country. We were a poor country. Here's what we did. Here's how successful we were. You can learn from that. I've noticed that goes on quite a bit. And I want to pick up on India. I was in a meeting at ICMR in Delhi in the fall, and I was so struck there by they described to me a meeting that they had invited 15 ministers from Africa, and they were not going to let the Chinese have the African continent. They maybe weren't going to call it One Belt, One Road initiative, but they'd be darned if they couldn't do a similar, that India had a great deal to share. And I think an interesting thing to look at will be what Ilona's just talked about, which is what happens with India. There's a lot more attention being given to China, but after all, if you look at economic growth or you look at the technology industry and the science sector, India has a tremendous amount to offer. And I just think that, although I jumped on China in my answer, I think India has been a bit more subtle. I think that was the point you were trying to make in some ways. But I think we're going to see, maybe in a different way, but a lot more from, and I'm interested, I hope you will ask the ambassador today to really talk frankly about what India's plans are, because I think those are less known. China has made much more of it. I mean, it's in their constitution now, and they've really made a point of this. I think with India, they're not quite there yet. I think Modi's not sure, but I do think it's important to watch India as well. The only other comment I want to make and then turn it over, just so on the operational part of WHO, you mentioned malaria. I want to assure you that with AIDS, WHO tried very hard to be operational. When I had the privilege of running the global program on AIDS, there were 500 people in that program working in 80 countries. And we'll talk more this afternoon why that was shut down. But probably the biggest effort that WHO has ever made, ever, in being operational was in AIDS. And I think there's real lessons to be learned on what the capabilities are, even more so than in malaria. But that's all I'll say for now. I'll let the rest for you.
Thanks.
The German question?
The German question, what was that? SDGs. Oh my. Yes, the architecture. Oh, I'm passing that on to my colleagues here. That's a tough question.
So I'll just make a few comments on R&D and innovation and global governance broadly, because I do think, picking up on the theme of WHO, what's interesting to observe is how WHO has begun setting priorities for R&D within AMR, for example, by identifying a priority list of pathogens that require new investment in new antibiotics, antimicrobials. Similarly, for outbreaks, there's a priority list of pathogens and a mapping of R&D activities. And these are things that are very useful for helping the global community to organize itself, because I think what we see is a very complex system that self-organizes around R&D, but a really critical role that WHO has been asked to play for a long time, quite frankly, has been asked to set R&D priorities for a long time. And now that it has begun doing so, we see a quite incredible response. When WHO published its first list, the AMR priority pathogens list, that got news coverage worldwide. And I think people within WHO, I mean, they should speak for themselves on this, I think there was a bit of surprise, like, wow, there's some real normative power here. And of course, that list didn't come out of nowhere. It was based on evidence and expert consultation and this and that. But it was a legitimate process, as David would say, of technical experts. But it really does have power to help the system organize itself. And I think we actually didn't see that in HIV. We saw it with HIV guidelines being issued. We saw a very clear normative role for WHO that became extremely important and complementary to the Global Fund and PEPFAR and others. But it's also a reflection of how WHO's role is evolving as the global system evolves. So this brings me to the challenging question about the ideal global health architecture. I would flip the question on its head, actually, and ask a different one, which is, how do we know that the global health ecosystem is functioning? It's functioning properly, that it's healthy, that it's performing the tasks that we need it to perform as an ecosystem filled with literally thousands, if not more, but thousands of players who do self-organize in many ways. Because I think the metaphor of architecture is perhaps less accurate, less reflective of what's happening in the world today than it used to be. And so when I teach on this in my classes, I talk more about systems and functions performed by systems. And we can have a longer conversation about what functions need to be performed and how do we know the system is working and is it resilient. But I think that's what I would emphasize. So when we look at AMR, do we know that we're getting a better grip on tracking resistance, that we're developing the new drugs that are needed to address pathogens for which resistance is already quite entrenched, that we're slowing down the emergence of resistance. For me, that's less about the architecture and more about the overall functioning of the system. I think the last thing I would mention that I really meant to say earlier is that, of course, the AMR example that I gave earlier, the small companies, this is funded also by Germany, very important financial contributions from Germany to GARD-P. And I think it is an example of a new kind of emphasis on global health. So when we talked a lot about donors and recipients, in some ways that was Global Health 1.0. Right, where a lot of the attention, certainly among scholars, was on money and about this donor-aid relationship. And I think today, of course money still matters, it will always matter, but today what is equally important, arguably maybe even more important, I'm not sure, is rulemaking, agreements, coordination, global public goods. And for me, R&D for a new antibiotic for AMR, for gonorrhea, that's a global public good, because guess what? Drug-resistant gonorrhea exists in the north, it exists in the south, it exists everywhere. So can you get a bunch of funders together to say, we will invest in a new drug for drug-resistant gonorrhea, because that's going to benefit everyone, which is a very different logic from people over there might hurt me, and so I need to put some money over there to protect myself. It's a very, very different type of collective action problem and a different logic that will drive cooperation. So I think the big question, coming back to China, India, Brazil, Germany, Switzerland, a number of countries, Finland, Norway, countries that have played leadership roles in global health, will play leadership roles in global health. A big question is not only about the money, but the production of global public goods, the negotiation of rules, intellectual leadership, ideational leadership. Are we going to have that? Where is it going to come from? Who's going to influence? What is on the agenda in the first place? What are the solutions that are put on the table? I think that will be increasingly important, and money will need to follow, but that much more than the donor-recipient relationship.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for giving me an opportunity to clarify. I guess what I'd say is I'm not critical of WHO's Health Emergencies Program. I'm more concerned for the WHO. And I think there are 4 key challenges for the organisation moving forward. Number 1, insufficient funding. We've already seen this has been a problem. Even for getting the $100 million contingency fund hasn't been fully funded yet, unlikely to be fully funded. Why? Because member states don't like giving $100 million to an international organisation to manage. They like to sort of make donations when they feel it's in their interest to do so. So I think insufficient funding for the program, it's extraordinarily ambitious. The budget went from an initial, I think it was $494 million over a biennial period, to the next projected period was something like 684. It was like a 20 to 30% increase within a 2-year time frame. So, and that's not even the extent of it yet. And I've been trying to sort of find out from WHO, like what sort of, when this program is fully operational, what sort of money and resources are you really looking at? What are we talking about? And they don't know themselves yet. I think the organisation has been doing really well with the Health Emergencies Program at the moment in being able to do what it has done. Like they've got, during Ebola, one of the reasons why the organisation was sort of accused of not responding sufficiently well was that they were dealing with 6 level 3 emergencies. Well, at the moment, WHO is dealing with 9. You know, so I think the organisation, the Health Emergencies Program, is actually doing really well under the leadership, but this is a problem. Insufficient funds, number one. Number two, raising expectations. Margaret Chan was right when she got criticised, got interviewed with the New York Times during Ebola, and she was like, basically she was asked, like, why didn't you do a better job? And Margaret Chan was right when she said, like, people have to understand WHO is not a first responder. Governments are the first responders, and we are there to support and help coordinate them. WHO now is becoming a first responder with this organisation, so with the Health Emergencies Program. So expectations are being raised. Now WHO is going to have multiple people spread throughout all three levels of the organisation, which are meant to be able to rapidly deploy to a crisis, basically to help manage it. What happens if they don't manage it particularly well? Well, member states will quite reasonably say, well, we've given you all this money, you haven't done a good job, you still can't get it right. Even if WHO does manage it well, member states may not be happy with the performance because they think the WHO exercised a little bit too much autonomy. That was one of the criticisms of its SARS response. Well, yeah, you did well, and everyone was praising it at the time, but afterwards they were criticising it. So related to that is the question, the third challenge is member state sovereignty. That we still, WHO can see an emergency unfolding, but it can't send people into that country, again, without the invitation of member states. This has been a consistent problem. When they send people, they get held at the border, they're not allowed to enter. Dealing with the issue of, like, what happens if WHO takes a ruling that a member state isn't happy with, how does that play out in terms of state sovereignty? And the fourth major challenge, I think, is the internal culture for the organisation. You've got an entity which for 70 years has been a norm agenda-setting organisation. Very slow, very methodical. People talk about it being the medical mafia, all the rest of it. But it's got a way of working. And if you think about it in terms of a hospital, that's your main hospital. Now what they're trying to do with the Health Emergency Program is create an emergency department at the same time. They're very two different cultures. And you've got one hand, a group of people now that are managing the Health Emergencies Program that have to be extraordinarily comfortable in managing and responding to a crisis in tremendous uncertainty. And they may get it wrong. And at the same time, you've got the rest of the organisation that's like, oh, but what does member states say? They're not scared of their own shadow, but pretty close. And they're constantly checking with member states, is this going to be a problem? Are you okay if we do this? Now, these two sides of the organisation have to reconcile somehow. And I think that's a real big challenge internally for the organisation. So my concern or my criticism is more coming from a position of concern. I don't want to see, with the next crisis, calls emerging for the abolition of WHO like we saw with Ebola. That is not the solution. If you set up another entity, you're just going to confront the exact same problems. And you don't have an organisation then that has got 70 plus years of legitimacy behind it for its good public health work. So I consider myself a friend of WHO. I think they're doing a good job in a difficult circumstance. I'm still astounded that the Health Emergency Program has been set up. On the SDGs, very quickly, what is the SDGs? I mean, it's a basket case of options, really. Can you build a perfect architecture for that? No. And I would tend to agree with Suerie, change the focus to look at the functions, and then try and make sure that the institutions that we're creating are fit for purpose to deal with the functions. More hybridity arguably is needed because we are seeing governments withdrawing. They don't want to pay as much as what they had previously. There's a lot of questions about, taxpayer funding and being able to demonstrate value for money. Unless that dynamic changes, which I don't think it will, then we need more hybridity, we need different actors. But focus on the functions. Have that emergency responder focus, sure, but what's the institution to do that? It's been set up in WHO, but you've got other organisations that also can contribute to that, and it's then maybe about bringing them together. And I'm just going to say one final comment on China as someone who lives in the region. Australia and China, obviously, we've got a very good, strong relationship. We've had a few kerfuffles and issues of late around Chinese interference in Australian politics. But let me just add that the view from the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific towards China's activism is very different. There's a lot of countries that are very concerned about this sort of more robust front from China. They're seeing the behaviour of the Chinese government in the South China Sea. They're seeing, you know, the Ebola response, they were predominantly military. Now the PLA have apparently come out and said, well, we did a really good job in Ebola, and we think that this is something that we can offer the international community, and particularly the region. Our region is prone to natural disasters, so we can send our military out to help with that sort of thing. You've got a lot of other Asian countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, many other countries that are like, we're not so sure about that. So, you know, I think there's going to be it's going to be an interesting time, I think, over the next, and the fault line between China and India, that was originally going to be what I was going to say, was India to look at as an actor, so I'm glad it has come up. Because it is, I think, a reasonably silent actor in the background, but the fault line between China and India, as two major powers in the same region, is going to be interesting to watch.
Can I just make one comment to you about your analysis, which I've heard here today, and that's on the innovation front in terms of moving forward. I think in health, you may have undersold how much, Suerie was referring primarily to innovative financing. But if you look at artificial intelligence, if you look at big data, I think we're going to see enormous opportunities in global health through innovation, in financing, in science, and in discovery, in how we can use data to help plan our health programs, as we're starting to see in the US and in Europe. So I just want to encourage you to think more in your work about, at least when it comes to health, where innovation may take us in a very optimistic way. Now, it's a little bit frightening for me. I can barely use my iPad, but I think when I look at if I look at Dario and others like Dario, the future is enormously productive, and just the use of drones in healthcare now around the world is remarkable in delivering healthcare. So I just want to encourage you in your next book or wherever you're going with Ilona to think more about where innovation, and you talked a lot about the financing innovation, which I think is radically, if I had to pick another topic, Ilona, where we're headed in global health that's going to make a big difference, it's going to be in the innovative financing space. I just wanted to add that.
Well, thank you very much. Being in Switzerland, we try to be punctual, which we are. There are some sandwiches, I'm told, for those of you that want to join us because they're staying on for the afternoon, which I hope many of you can. You have the program there. We will talk about leadership, particularly political leadership, in the afternoon. And then we will have the launch of Mike and Steve's book, and we'll have the opportunity to talk even more about some of the HIV/AIDS developments and their impact on global health. Could I ask you to give a big thank you to this panel who were willing to answer my questions? Thanks a lot, and we start again at 2 o'clock. Thank you.